after arriving in where we had Felix before this. Okay, and this is chapter 25. So he is before Felix. And this Felix is a bad human being, not a good ruler. Even in the history outside, he is relatively insignificant. He is more or less a slave. Are we live here?
Yeah.
So is that better?
That didn't help the TV. No.
We can't see the TV. We can't see that screen.
Okay,
It's just white.
So we're in Acts chapter 25. Pick up your Bible, the old version or your
Anybody
Ted
talks,
version,
when you guys are done, just sit down.
and we'll work these things out. Thank you, Corey.
I want more too.
Can we just stand for you?
Good luck.
That didn't sound too hopeful. Yeah. So we're in Acts chapter 25. Let's go back and let's talk about Felix before we get to Festus. And Felix has a problem with Paul because the Jews want Paul dead, period. They don't really care what the charges are. The charges are kind of a separate issue in the sense that the Romans care what the charges are, but the Jews want Paul dead. And so they've trumped up charges because he's taken in this, they claim he's taken in this guy named Trophius or something to that effect into the temple as a Gentile. And so, but that really is not the issue. They want him dead. He's the people who followed Paul through all of Asia, and all of Macedonia, and particularly from Ephesus, have chased Paul down to this place, informed the high priest and the leadership that Paul is the one making all this trouble about this Nazarene guy. And this sect, this Jewish cult, if you want, that presents danger to the covenant people, which is represented by the leadership and the high priest. So they're doing to Paul what they did to Jesus, but this time it's not with the help of the mob. They don't have the moment in time that they have with Jesus. And they have a bigger problem. Paul is a Roman citizen. And so Felix is the kind of weak, politically driven human being. He knows that his predecessor got in bad with the high priest, and he doesn't want to, turn the high priest against him. So he keeps Paul in house imprisonment for about 2 years. Paul lives down in Caesarea along the coast in the care not only of the church but under the protective custody of the Romans. And so Felix doesn't want to antagonize the high priest because they are the proxy power structure for the Romans. But at the same time, he is still accountable to Claudius, who was the emperor at that time. Let me go a second or two into Claudius. Claudius is the emperor who ejected all of the Jews out of Rome. And many of them ended up in Corinth, where Paul lived with them for a long time. And the Jews were having a conflict, a religious conflict within themselves about this certain Chrestus. I think it was a Roman historian who talked about this. It's extra biblical. And the Chrestus was a misspelling. In other words, they were having a conflict over Jesus Christ in Rome, and Claudius said, I've had enough of this, and the Jews and everything they're doing, and he expelled them. That happens around 52 AD. And that's close to the end of Claudius' reign. And at this point, the Romans are very clear about what's going on here. They know the complaints that the Jews have against Christians. The Christians in Rome were not, the only way that they're related at all to Paul is through Cyrus of Cyrene and his his sons who are in Rome at that point. We hear about that at the end of chapter 16 of Romans. And so we know that Claudius was the emperor at that time. At this point, his term is ended, and a new guy is in charge in Rome. And Felix and Festus have to answer to that Roman too. So they're in this really nasty middle position between the nationalism and that desire of all Jews to be rid of their oppressing class, their oppressor. First it was the Persians, then it was the Greeks, then it was the Syrians, the Ptolemies in Egypt, then it was the Syrians above to the north, and now it's the Romans. They want to be rid of their oppressor. They have this dream of the golden age of David coming back. And whoever is in charge of this area has to appeal both to Rome and to the high priest, through the proxy power structure. And it's a terrible position. I mean, nobody wants this assignment. And they sure don't want to be in Jerusalem for this assignment. They sent, their soldiers up there and their tribunes, and they had their power up there just to keep the peace. A beautiful place for them to be down there. It was very Roman, Caesarea was. And so when Festus is basically Felix before this is basically pushed out of power, and in comes Festus. So Festus says 3 days after arriving in the province, he's brand new. He's the new guy, and he's actually well spoken of. He is the person that's in charge when Jerusalem actually falls. And Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the high priest and Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. See, he doesn't really want to do this. It's a pain. He's just having to go up there and deal with them. So that's the first thing on their minds. They've got to get rid of Paul. And they requested Festus, verse 3, they requested Festus as a favor to them to have Paul transferred to Jerusalem. And it was all innocent, right? This is where we hold our court. And, let's bring him up there, and we'll, you're the new guy. You want to do us a favor. This works good for us. It's part of our relationship with one another. And of course, if you read the text, you know what their real ambition was. And Paul had family members up there, and they're connected to some of these people. They know what's coming this way. Luke obviously knows in advance what's going on. There's no secret to why they wanted to do it. I'm sure they put on a nice show. It says, this is kind of where we do things. This is where we have our court, and this is the right thing to do. Well, it had an ulterior motive, but they were preparing to ambush him along the way. Now, no matter how you do it, going up to Jerusalem is risky. If you don't go up along the top of what they call the wadis, you're going to go through little valleys that are just inherently dangerous. They're bad neighborhoods. If you want to ambush somebody, this is the place to get them. And the Romans knew this. They weren't stupid. So it was going to be a very risky thing no matter what. But Festus answered, Paul is being held in Caesarea, and I myself am getting the heck back there soon too. That was a little bit of Russell translation, but you got the drift. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if this man has done anything wrong with it, press charges with him there. Nice political answer. Keeping Paul in protective custody and saying you still got to come down to Caesarea to deal with Roman law. And so there's this difference between Roman law and Jewish law, which theoretically is related to the covenant, but it's also many hundreds of years old now. Kind of like our Constitution. They had precedents that had set the terms of how they interpreted Jewish law. They had advanced, vast, set of, under laws from that. I'm trying really to be very politically neutral on this, but I mean, it's not unlike how our courts have interpreted the Constitution. And by this time, Jesus has already made clear, you love your traditions. He's not saying traditions bad. He's saying you set up precedents that have turned the law, the covenant, into a burden for people. And so you've got, from the Roman perspective, that's just about their religion. And it works good for them because their religion can keep people under control. That's why Cyrus wanted them to reestablish their law. So it worked really well for the occupier. Just let them handle things their own way. I don't think it's a lot different than the way we allow imams and certain Muslim leaders to do what they need to do with their people as long as they handle it and don't get in anybody's way. We can deal with Saddam Hussein. I don't know, when did Saddam Hussein become a problem for us? Probably when he invaded Kuwait, right? Before that, you don't hear much about Americans having a problem with this guy. So it's the same kind of relationship. As long as you don't intersect Roman interest to our disadvantage, we'll let you do what you need to do over here to keep control of the people that you're keeping. And that is the problem that Festus has. Because Festus knows that he still has to answer to this new Roman emperor that's coming in. And so after spending 8 or 10 days with them, doing who knows what, Festus went back down to Caesarea. And the next day, he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. But he hasn't met Paul yet. So all he's got is the bad information about Paul. And now he's going to meet Paul. And he says, when Paul came in, the Jews had come down from Jerusalem and stood around him. And they brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove it. Because, see, the Romans needed the witnesses to be there. You need to be able to, it's just like now, you had to be able to face your accuser. And by this time, the whole case had grown very, very cold. And all the Jews could do was come back and just try to rehearse or go back through what they had done with Felix before this. So then Paul made his defense. I've done nothing wrong. This is factually true. It's Jewish law against the temple or against Caesar. 3 points. He did not violate the law by bringing Trophius into the court of the Gentiles or into the court of the Jews as a Gentile. Factually incorrect. And there's no witnesses to say otherwise. He hasn't violated any Jewish law. In fact, before Felix, he's already made the case. Not only did I not violate it, I took vows, I shaved my head, I paid for the offerings of the people around me. I didn't violate it. I actually honored that law, the law of our ancestors. So he's already made these points that far from violating, he's really honored and upheld it. He hasn't violated the temple, and he hasn't violated Roman law. At this point, the best thing you can say to describe this situation is that Paul is a political prisoner. There's no other way to look at this, because he hasn't violated any law, either Roman or Jewish. And so he sits in protective custody. He's being taken care of. It's not a bad gig. And so Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, he's new, I want to do something good for you, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? It is a compromise, because he's got Roman protection when he gets there. It's just that there's going to be a conflict on the way. What is the key principle Not just then, but now. You know, the Romans are interested in their political interest. And the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, is all they're trying to maintain here. You can do everything else you want to do, but you keep the peace. Well, if they take him up there, they know they're going to have a conflict. And Festus would love to be able to resolve this to everybody's satisfaction, except for Paul. Paul answered, I'm standing here in Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I've not done any wrong to the Jews, and as you yourself know very well, if, however, I'm guilty of anything deserving death, I don't refuse to die. I'll die for the right things. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. And Festus conferred with his council. He brought in all his buddies from Harvard Law. And he brought in the older guys because he's fairly young. And they said, well, you know, he's got that right. So, and when you look at how the Romans deal with the situation, they're dealing with it legally. I mean, they're dealing, I hate to say this, they're dealing with it justly. You know, they're not allowing trumped up charges in politics to overcome this one individual's right. And from the Jewish perspective, they look at what Paul doing is dividing their own people, their own society. You know, it isn't so much that he's contradicting their laws as it is that he's presenting a new view. He's looking at it in a new light. And just as Jesus did, you know, I didn't come to nullify, I came to fulfill it. And so it does represent a threat to the Jews because it calls them out for having elevated tradition over their law, elevating things that have nothing to do with the covenant relationship over the covenant. And that's why it's so important to look at the people of Israel when you look at them as God's people. It isn't about race. It just isn't. You know, I mean, you see even Rahab the prostitute's not Jewish, but there she is in the genealogy of Jesus. And there are lots of people who aren't Jewish that follow God. And so it's not about the race, it's about the covenant. And when you read Paul says, it isn't about Jews as a race, it's about Jews as a people of God, covenant people. And that's important to understand here, okay? Because this is about politics. This isn't about the covenant right here. This is about the law. It's not about the covenant. Now, who is the Caesar that he's appealing to? Anybody know? Because Caesar is like the emperor. It's a political title. You know the name of this guy that he just appealed to? You do know the name.
It's not Nero yet, is it?
Yeah, it's Nero. Nero took power in about 52 AD. So he's fairly new at this juncture too. And we get all of our opinion of Nero from what he did in 64 AD, about 8 to 10 years in. Yeah, you know, I mean, there's a whole lot of debate about whether the Christians were in charge of that, but no matter what he did, he made a political decision to blame Christians in 64 AD. And his persecution of Christians at that point was localized to Rome. When you get to 90 AD, it's Domitian that persecutes those churches in Asia, those 7 churches in Asia that are spoken of in the book of Revelation. So at this juncture, that's a smart decision. At this juncture. And it's a practical decision, it's a legal decision, it's not necessarily, it isn't really even a religious description, a religious decision for Paul. He has appealed to Caesar because at the moment, The Roman law is the best friend he's got. So Festus consults with King Agrippa. This is our other Herod. And you need to get a sense. Agrippa and Bernice, that's his sister. They're a year apart. They're very, very young at this juncture. Okay, I think I've got a nice piece of art. No, I don't. So I'm going to come back to that. I got it later. A few days later, Agrippa and Bernice arrived in Caesarea to visit with Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, "There's this man here whom Felix left as my he, left it on my plate. And when I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them there's not Roman custom," which is interesting. I don't know why you used that. I'm going to have to look that word. It wasn't Roman custom to hand over anyone before they had faced their accusers and have the opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. He's had that. It's just that the Jews can't produce those accusers. They've gone back to Ephesus. They've left a long time ago. And when they came here, verse 17, they came here with me. I did not delay the case, but I convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. When his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. See, he'd already done his research. He already knew what was going on here. It was among the first things that Festus did when he took over power. And I mean, it's like, I've got to deal with this Paul situation. And the Jews were there to make that happen. Instead, verse 19, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, who Paul claimed was alive. Yeah, there's your stumbling stone. And on top of that, there's the religious problem of the resurrection, which divides even the Sanhedrin up in Jerusalem. The Romans don't care about life. You could say the Romans are very tolerant when it comes to issues of law and religion. They would allow you to worship any god you wanted to worship, as long as you kept it civil. Boy, doesn't that sound familiar? Would we love to have a civil discussion? And that's all Paul is asking for. So just try me on the facts. Let's talk about the truth. And those are things that the Jews at this juncture aren't interested in up in Jerusalem. They're interested truly in this Jesus of Nazareth, this sect that has grown to be quite a problem in their view at this point. And they're throwing everything they've got at Paul, because Paul is the primary. I wonder why they didn't do that against Peter. Why not Peter? Or James, the brother of Jesus, who's the leader of the church. Why didn't those people give the Romans or the Jews any pause? Why weren't they a problem? It's just Paul. And the reason, one of the best reasons is Paul, and why they chased him, is that he has gone throughout the Gentile world, through the Jewish synagogues, to preach Jesus as the Christ, as the Messiah. And the people who are anti-Christ don't like Paul. Did I use a loaded term there? I did. This anti-Christ thing, right? Because when you start to look at the anti-Christ people, often it's not just one individual. It's people who are chasing the Christians from town to town to town. And they chased him all the way to Jerusalem, and then just couldn't stay there long enough to finish the issue. It's political. I mean, on one hand, it's very religious. It's about, they can make it about the law. They can say, he's not the Messiah. But what Paul represents is the in-your-face reality is the Messiah has come and you have rejected him. And that's even Peter's sermon at the beginning of Acts. So there's politics here, but there's also this problem about this dead man, Jesus. Same problem that Claudius had with the Jews in Rome. Now, this is a big deal. It's not just about one man. This is about a movement of people called Christians who allow Jews or Gentiles to be part of their fellowship. And so that represents a real threat to the cohesion of God's people by allowing Gentiles in. And that threatened the power of Jews all over the world, particularly even in their own synagogue. I was at a loss, verse 20, I was at a loss at how to investigate such matters. So I asked if he'd be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on his charges, but when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. It's kind of like the perp asking for a lawyer, except this time because it was a capital offense, at least it's a capital accusation, his only recourse is to go to Rome and to appeal before a person that all of us know how that's going to end for Paul. But Paul, if you read it in Romans, often says that these people in power are appointed by God. They don't have power unless it's given to them by God. I think I'm going to stop here. Well, let me see. Let me see if I can do this right. I would like to hear this man myself. Agrippa and Bernice are really young. They're brother and sister. And so this is going to be the lesson next week. Okay? And the artist, it's a Renaissance painting, does a pretty good picture. I don't think Paul wore chains there. He was under house arrest. He presented no threat to them. So the artist didn't get that right. The artist seems to show Paul as being haggard. But I find this really a really interesting picture. I think that's a high priest. Oh, Ananias is no longer the high priest. Ananias has been replaced too. So now they've got a new high priest. And the new high priest has all the same problems that Ananias had with the political leadership in Jerusalem. And so they all have a problem with Paul.
So who's the guy to the left of Agrippa?
You mean this guy?
No.
The one seated?
Yeah, the one seated.
Next.
This is Antipas II, and that's Bernice.
Okay.
Okay, and they're kind of local leaders. They don't have the power of Herod the Great, and everybody after Herod the Great got less and less power. And so they're really young. They got it because they're related to their father. Their father's dead, and now they're in charge. They're kids, and they probably had the good education at that time. They got all their degrees, and they don't own a whole bunch of college loans. Wait, no, wrong period. But I want to put that before you, and just it's kind of the thing. And I promise you, I'm not being political here, okay? But as I read through the book of Acts, I can see the danger, and at the same time the advantage of appealing to the civil society and to the existing laws to retain your rights, because those are people in positions of government who are theoretically in charge with being just. for the people. And at this point, the only civil law is the Roman law. I think about Joseph in the Old Testament. And Joseph, it's at one point becomes the Pharaoh's second in charge. And he's in such a good position that he can bring his family from Israel into Egypt to benefit from his political connections. And you read through the book of Exodus, it says, "But then came a Pharaoh who did not know." And so the political advantage evaporated immediately. It just evaporated. And soon, instead of being politically connected, they were slaves in Israel. And as I look over and over and over again, even with Daniel existed in the king's courts. And yet, from one time to the next, the political leadership changed and his position became tenuous. And yet he depended on God, and God protected him through the changes of these political leaderships. But everywhere you look in the text, it says where people have married themselves into people in position of political power, it goes away. It goes away. I can walk you through a whole lot of history from the Roman Catholic Church that married politics to the Holy Roman Empire, to Constantine and Justinian, who located all of their political power under the cross. To Martin Luther, who really started the Protestant Reformation. But he married the political clout of the Reformation to the political law in Germany, to John Calvin in Switzerland, who, yes, was a big part of the Calvinist Protestant Reformation. What did he do? He used religion to stop these people called the Anabaptists from getting into power, who believed that you shouldn't be baptized unless you had expressed faith first, that baptism wasn't your ticket into the church. And so he killed Anabaptists. The reason they're called Anabaptists is he said, you want to be baptized? We're going to put you in a chair and we're going to baptize you to death over and over again.
So is it fair to say that, everybody wants to separate politics and religion, faith and politics.
Everybody but politicians.
Yeah.
Let's be clear. Go ahead and finish your question.
Well, they're always trying to do that. And you can't. I don't think you can.
Okay, so let me use a different word than religion.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is a political science word. I learned it way back forever at Clemson, where they
Really?
taught
Words like that there?
where they taught that the one thing a leader has to have is legitimacy. They have to have legitimacy. And religion and being appointed by God has been used by emperors and kings and pharaohs forever. Divine right. Okay? And it's not till you get into the mid-19th century, and particularly in the early 20th century, that there were leaders who said, we don't need religion at all. But I'm going to tell you that in Louisiana, from South Carolina and North Carolina, where we're from, that's where a lot of Protestants, particularly Presbyterians, Scottish, they came there for religious freedom. And it wasn't even from Roman Catholics, it was from the Anglican Church. And it was from certain Presbyterians, even in Ireland, that they were escaping to do what? To have religious freedom. The political, the civil society turned against them. And so those are the same folks that gave us the disestablishment clause in the First Amendment of the Constitution. They didn't want people from this denomination to say, you can't come in and mess with religion in our state. I want to continue to challenge you. We've got to be careful about appealing to Caesar. You know, Jesus said, give him what belongs to him. We've got to be careful that we don't marry ourselves, because that is transient. It just goes away. You know, in a moment's notice, we can go from being in the Pharaoh's court to being his slaves. And so, you know, this is that instance. And you've got children, virtually speaking, children, millennials, for heaven's sake, Generation Z, in charge. Paul hasn't got very much hope of getting a reasonable. They're just curious. He's going to find liberation from the man who ultimately kills him. And I say all that because I'm a Baptist, okay? I don't know if you know this, but we're kind of Baptist in this church. We don't know it, but we are. Baptists are the ones who said, we want to live our lives by faith. If you're going to be baptized, you're going to be baptized not because it's some religious ritual, but because you believe. And those are the people that came to South Carolina and North Carolina and lived out in the middle of nowhere and built little churches because they believed that faith and faith alone was the reason we're saved. And I think we've got to get back to that. If we're going to make it through this new generation that is already here, we need to fall back into the place where God knows that we depend on him. He doesn't leave us from the possibility of suffering. But we've got to live in a civil society, but it doesn't mean that we stop being people of faith. Let me say a prayer here and we'll go to worship. Father, I just lift this class up. I lift up our hearts and minds. Those who are concerned about what's going on in the world and all the division and the strife and the anger. That, Father, help us to find our peace. Help us to find our rest in you. And let it begin in worship. Let us acknowledge you. In the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. So thank you.
Thank you.
For coming with us and joining us. We got about half our class, which ought to be at the bye. It has become a weird thing. You know, I teach at Grand Canyon University, and I have to stand in front of a camera for half of my class. So it makes me try to be a little conscious about not getting inappropriate and everything. Sometimes it's